Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast. Powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising. With Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters.
Welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast. Phil's actually on holiday. He's sunning himself somewhere in the Aegean, and anyone who follows him on Instagram will probably be familiar with what he's been eating and drinking and how he's been spending his time. So we're wishing Phil an enjoyable holiday, certainly well-deserved. So this week we're joined by friend of the pod, Coachworks founder and industry guru, Karl Davis. So welcome back to the podcast, Karl. Now, I understand you've got a man cold, which is exactly what I had last week when I was recording the pod.
Yeah, I wouldn't actually say it's, thank you for the intro, and it's good to be back. I wouldn't say it's a man cold. I'd describe it more of a man flu. You know, this is not any old cold. So my apologies if I'm wheezing and coughing. I'll try not to be too repulsive during this podcast.
Well, we would expect nothing less from you, Karl. So, as I say, welcome back. It's great to have you back. Now, before we get on with the show, there's been a lot of interest in our recent interview with Victor Zhang, the UK boss of Amoda and JQ, the two new Cherry brands launching in the UK. So, just a reminder that interview, the full interview, is available on your podcast feed or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This week, on this week's show, we're joined after the midway break for the latest Menable moment from our mental wealth wizard and the compare with no compare, which is how I promised to introduce him from now on, Stephen Whitton, who this week is talking about managers being tasked focused versus people focused and how that's panning out in car retailing. Now, before we look at this week's car retailing headlines, I thought it would be a good opportunity to catch up with you, Karl, to see what you've been up to recently, and also an update on the forthcoming podcast that you announced just a few weeks ago on Motor Trade Radio when you were co-hosting with Phil. So can you give us an update on your critical friend?
Yeah, that's very kind of you. I've been busy on lots of levels, and I've got this sort of hybrid work life going on at the moment, which is just stimulating me in so many respects. And the Critical Friend podcast, your Critical Friend podcast, is something that I'm really inspired by. So we're about a couple of weeks from going live. I think I did mention to the listeners a month or so ago that this is a once weekly micro podcast, almost like a BBC Thought for the Day, about 60 seconds in duration. And then bi-monthly, we're going to follow it up with an interview. And I'm going to keep the interview pretty tight to 15 minutes, where I'm interviewing people that I admire that have got stories to tell that I think will be of interest to the listener. But I think that the difference with what I'm trying to do is I want it to be a low time investment, because not everybody's got that half an hour or 45 minutes free. I want it to be hopefully high engagement, and I'd like it to be shared with peers. And that's really important, because this is a podcast that's not going to be monetized. It's quite the opposite. It's about giving back, and it's going to have a direct link, a URL and QR code to Prostate Cancer UK, where there's a 30-second online risk checker. So I'd like to see that this podcast gets people checking their position, maybe getting a blood test, and who knows, saving a life. And the other final thing, Curse, is it's not purely motor industry specific, because it's a leadership podcast, and it's going to cover 5 things: being relevant, setting direction, creating culture, leading teams, and driving performance. And I think you'd agree that applies in any sector, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. I mean, those disciplines can be applied to any sector. It's not automotive specific. So yeah, I mean, I'll be intrigued to listen to the podcast when they go live. But I've got a question for you, Karl. How did you come up with the name?
Well, it's a title. Critical friend is a badge that I've been given many times over the years. When I first started consulting in professional services nearly 25 years ago now, there was lots of other titles for me, like Marmite and things like that. But I've been working on my bedside manner, and it's more about being a critical friend. And I actually thought about this long and hard. I've run my own operations for nearly 25 years. I've run other people's operations, and leadership can be lonely, particularly if you're the business owner or CEO, and expectations of you can be high and the bloody weight of responsibility heavy. And the truth of the matter is leaders can be consumed in the day job and create little time to think. And also, if you're really into the depth of your business, you can be too close to see things clearly, let alone see the bigger picture. So, if I may, I'll just expand on that. Over the years of doing what I've done, I've seen some really big decisions rushed and then poorly made. And often that leads to a drop in performance. Morale hits the rock bottom, and the credibility of the leader is impacted as well. And it needn't be like that, Curtis. If leaders just concede to the fact that some things are blooming complex and recognise the importance of surrounding themselves with diverse thinkers, it gets easier. And you'll know, you see it, you interview a lot of them in bigger organisations where there's a board of directors. Some of those organisations have non-exec directors to bring an independent sort of view. And regardless of business size, the leader needs someone that's got their back, and it needs to be a person that I think supports their ambitions, but still has an independent mind, and someone that will challenge their thinking and tell them when they're wrong. And I think that person is called a critical friend. It's a label I'm happy to wear today. And when I was growing my business, I had a variety of critical friends, but I actually had 3 non-exec directors over a period of about 12 years. And they played an important role in just keeping me focused, putting my hat on straight, and sometimes to be a critical friend in whatever format, you've got to put your big pants on and give the feedback that maybe isn't going to be wanted, but needs to be heard. So that's why I've called it critical friend.
Yeah, and that does actually make perfect sense. So thanks for sharing that with us, Karl. And so the first podcast goes live toward the end of the month, and
Yeah.
what we'll do on our podcast is just put out a little reminder as and when that happens, and also where our listeners can tune in and listen to it.
Well, yours and Phil's podcast has set a benchmark. Mine's a slightly different shape, but as I said to Phil a month or so ago, there's plenty of room there. I think the pressure and the responsibility on me is to add something a bit different. So that's what I'm trying to do.
Excellent. Headlines this week come from AM, Motor Trader, Car Dealer and the Daily Mail, starting with Southeast dealer group giant Glyn Hopkin sold to its workforce of over 800 people. Industry heavyweight named as new managing director of Lookers. Kia UK ranks first in latest UK customer satisfaction index. Fiat to reintroduce a petrol-engined 500 city car because older drivers don't want EVs. And we'll close this week with Ford goes back to the future as it revives an iconic name from its past. And Karl and I will be asking if that's good news for fans of the professionals. So looking forward to talking about that one, Karl.
We might have to explain to some of the younger listeners what the hell you're on about there, Curtis.
Yeah, exactly. All will become clearer towards the end. So starting with that first headline, and it's from AM Online. The headline is Glyn Hopkin Group sold to its workforce of over 800 people. So this is Glyn Hopkin Group, and they are a big players. They're ranked 37 in the most recent Motor Trader Top 200, and that's based on a turnover of £520 million. They were founded in 1993, so just recently celebrated their 30th anniversary, and they were founded by Glyn Hopkin. They're based in Romford, Essex. They have 35 sites and have grown considerably over recent years from their base in Romford across London, Essex, Hertfordshire, Suffolk, Buckinghamshire, up to Bedfordshire and Suffolk. They're multi-brand. They are the biggest Nissan dealer partner in the UK with 13 sites. And they also represent the likes of Fiat, Renault, Dacia, MG, Kia, Suzuki, and more. So this really is big news. So what's been announced is that the dealership has been it's gone into part of a sold as an employee ownership trust, which is known as a EOT. And the EOT allows company owners to sell part or all of their business free of capital gains tax to their employees. And that's actually without requiring any changes to the management structure, as the buyer is typically a trustee acting in the interest of all staff. So this is actually really welcome news, because it means that the business will continue in its current form, the current name, the current management structure, but will actually be effectively owned by the 800 strong employees. What did you make of this one, Karl?
Well, first of all, I can't profess to know, knowing Fraser. I've got some understanding of his business from people that have worked with him, and it's a business that is regarded highly in lots of ways. The bit that spiked my interest was the route that he's gone down, EOT, because I think that could be a tremendous retention tool for his employees, and particularly his senior management team. And do you know what, Chris? I started my business in 2001, and I probably would never have started it. I'd probably still have been in motor retail if I'd have had the opportunity to have a share in the business, which I was crazy passionate to run my own business, or at least be a part owner. And unfortunately, that never happened. So I went a different route. But I think EOT is not only good for the majority shareholder. I think it's good for the team. And how invested will you feel if you actually own part of the business, and you may well get a dividend on a successful year? I think it's a great story. I was actually working with a law firm on Tuesday of this week, talking about succession for the partners, and EOT was one of the things that we actually discussed. And my advice to them was, let's make sure that we're planning in good time for succession. And the senior partner in that particular business is 54. He's planning to retire at about 60, and needs to get that succession options clear. And EOT is one of them.
Yeah, and you mentioned Fraser Cohen, the chief executive. I interviewed Fraser several years ago, and I think it was at that time when they were really starting to ramp up their expansion, buying out dealerships, opening new dealerships. And he's quoted in the story as saying, "We are thrilled with the new ownership structure, which honours the dedication of our staff, many of whom have served 5, 10, 15, 20, and even 30 years. This EOT structure further rewards their contributions," which does kind of sum it up nicely. And EOTs, they are pretty unusual in our business. Having said that, in January, Phil and I covered a story about Helensburgh Toyota in Scotland, which also underwent EOT. But that was a single site, and it was sold to a trust formed by 34 employees, which certainly when we spoke about it, seemed like a really good positive way to go. And having that buy-in from the employees into the business. And this is pretty similar, but on a much bigger scale, because we're talking about a big group, 35 sites, 800 employees. So it's going to be a fascinating one to watch, isn't it?
It is, and it's pretty unproven, I think, in our sector, certainly unusual. So I'm going to watch it with real interest, and I really wish Glyn Hopkin Group and the team there, every success, because I think it's fascinating.
Moving on to the next story, which is from Car Dealer, and the headline is James Brearley appointed managing director of Lookers as dealer group looks for stability. So this is the news that broke during the week that James Brearley, friend of the podcast, in fact, we interviewed him only 2 or 3 months ago, has joined Lookers as managing director. Now, listeners will be familiar with James as a name, as a sort of industry legend, within the sector. He will be familiar to many listeners, as his career has spanned more than 2 decades at very senior levels with some of the biggest names in the industry, including Pendragon, where he helped grow the business from 8 to 350 sites, and was managing director of the Stratstone business for 10 years. After that, he was CEO of Inchcape for 5 years before joining the Peter Vardy Group probably about 15 months ago as chief operating officer. So, a real heavyweight figure there who's taken the lead at Lookers. What did you make of this one, Karl?
I totally agree. I think James Brearley is a heavyweight, and Lookers is a big operation. And from what I'm seeing and hearing, and I've been around a long time, and I'm trusted with lots of privileged information. I'm hearing that ship needs to be steadied, and there's a need to rebuild some trust and morale. And obviously, when businesses are bought and sold, that creates unease. But I think there is a big job to do there, a really big job, and obviously the immediate headcount cut on acquisition takeover will have definitely knocked morale, and I think with any new owner, and this is not necessarily directed at the Canadians that have bought Lookers, I think it's important that new owners take the time to understand what they bought, and not just what they bought, but the market that they're now operating in. And over the years, I've seen a polarity of performance from very arrogant to very measured, and I think it's a really interesting time for Lookers, and I'd extend that actually not just to acquisitions, but also starting businesses. And Dave Kendrick of UHY, we've seen in the press recently, has absolutely slated Cazoo. And I think some of the deep-rooted problems with Cazoo was the business founder and owner didn't really understand the market that they were operating in, and to burn through that much cash that quickly, and the dismal sort of ending to it all, is an example of not understanding what you've got and where you're playing, I think.
Yeah, I think you make a valid point there, Karl, because let's not forget that Global Auto Holdings, the Canadian owners of Lookers, they only bought the business in October last year, so that they are new to the business. They're new to the UK, and what I found encouraging about this story is that they've appointed someone who knows the UK automotive car retailing sector inside out at such a high level.
Yeah, as I said, I don't know James personally. I've met him briefly, but I know people that have worked with him shoulder to shoulder, and he's well regarded. And I think we'll start to see, I can think of several senior industry figures that will announce garden leave very shortly and go on to join James in 6 or 12 months' time, because he definitely attracts a following of performers, that's for sure.
Well, you heard that first here on the Motor Trade Radio podcast. So, we will watch this story. We'll track it very closely. And, of course, James, he's a friend of the pod. And, James, you're welcome back anytime. But we'll let you get settled in first. So moving on to the next story, it's from Motor Trader, and the headline is Kia UK ranks first in latest UK customer satisfaction index. So this is a kind of spin-off story from the latest UK satisfaction index, UKCSI. They do a report. It's a biannual report, and it's based on 60,000 survey responses from over 15,000 customers. So it's comprehensive, and it covers all retailing sectors. So it's not just automotive, but Kia is the highest place. I think in the story it's described as the highest place mainstream UK car brand within the survey. So it's secured first place in terms of automotive with a score of 81.4 points out of 100. So it scored the highest of any automotive brand in its net promoter score with 43.9 points. And NPS is very much the key measurement of a brand's customer loyalty and satisfaction. But it's worth looking at some of the brands who are in the top 10, because at the top of the pile, number one position is Timpson's, followed by Nationwide, the Building Society, followed by John Lewis, and then we've got Jet2 Holidays, Waitrose, Starling Bank, and M&S. So some big names there in the top 10, and Kia will be incredibly pleased with this listing, don't you think, Karl?
Yeah, I've got a view on Kia, but just before I share that, I just want to shine a light to number one, top spot, Timpson. If ever there was an example of a servant leader, it's that man, and his father before him that started the business and went down that sort of servant leader route. And you'll be aware that I think it's 10 or 12% of their workforce are people that have done prison time.
Yeah.
So I've got so much admiration for them, but equally, it's great to see more and more car brands performing highly in that all industry survey. Kia, in my opinion, is a class act. I've worked with a number of businesses that have the Kia franchise, a bit like Toyota, a bit like Lexus, a bit like Suzuki. They always talk about, a partnership approach, and I think in Kia there's some of the best leadership talent in the industry right now. And a former director of my business, shout out for Martin Riddell, he's a class act. He was in the Kia network back in 2012 when they heard about a 2020 vision. And Kia was a bit part player then, and it was about selling 100,000 cars in 2020. And they went on and did it. They had their plan, they had their strategy, they had a partnership approach, and they've got a profitable dealer network. So respect, absolute respect. And I think more and more good luck will continue to come Kia's way because they're making their own luck in the way that they're going about it.
Yeah, definitely. So hats off to Paul Philpott, the chief exec of Kia UK, and his team, because that was, as you say, you don't earn those sort of placings, those sort of ratings by accident. So after the break, we're joined by our mental wealth guru, Stephen Whitton, talking about being task-focused or people-focused in the showroom.
You're listening to all the chatter that matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand, wherever you are, and on your podcast feed. Next up is our latest Menable moment, looking at mental wealth and well-being awareness and best practice in the automotive sector. With me, Stephen Whitton. Yeah, hi everyone, it's Menable Moments time again. Hope you're well. It would seem that my last Menable Moments got me a little bit of feedback, in a good way, that is. And in that I got a few messages and some direct conversations with a few people who said how much they enjoyed listening to me talking about being discombobulated and how that's a word that we should use more often because they don't hear it often enough. So it did make me chuckle. So I want to give a little shout out to anyone who took part in those conversations, and I hope you're not feeling as discombobulated as you perhaps suggested you were anymore. So I hope everything's going in the right direction for you. But I've just been doing some work with some managers in a dealership today, and I took the word discombobulated into that session with me, and it's quite obvious, that many of them pretty much spend most of their days being a bit discombobulated, and I think I've come up with a bit of a theory as to why that might be. So I asked all of them, actually, to imagine on a bit of paper a grid. So an X and Y axis, just a big cross on a piece of paper. And on the one side, on the left-hand side of it, to look at whether you're task-focused, and on the other side, on the right-hand side as you look at it, are you people-focused? And pretty much to a person, most of them would put themselves on the task-focused side, which I thought, well, that's fascinating for managers, isn't it? That they see their role and their job as being much more task-oriented than people-oriented, or that they are naturally leaning towards being more task-focused. Then I asked them to lay over the next bit, which is the vertical axis of, are you introvert or extrovert? Introvert being at the bottom end and extrovert being at the top. So what you've got now is a grid where in the top right-hand corner, anyone who's task-oriented and a bit of an extrovert would be, and anyone who is more detail-oriented might be in the task and introvert section, which is down on the bottom. I hope you're trying this at home, by the way. If you're listening to this on a run, this is going to make no sense to you whatsoever. And that's kind of the point, because what I'm asking you to think about is probably completely messing with your wiring and making you a little bit discombobulated, just as it did with the managers that I went through this with and they were actually doing it on paper. But the point that it made them feel out of sorts or uncomfortable or, again, discombobulated was when we realised that actually the task focus and to some extent being a bit introverted actually means that we've put people into management roles, and the task, if you want to call it that, of managing people and inspiring them with energy, creativity and drive and determination actually in itself makes them discombobulated, because it's stretching them out of their comfort zone. And this is why a lot of these managers have slipped into their default, which is managing the process, managing the detail, managing the spreadsheet, managing all the stuff that gives them the analysis and the ability to do all of that day-to-day stuff by looking at the task. And so I asked them a simple question. When you go home at night, do you think about and reflect on all the tasks that you didn't get done? All the tasks that are hanging over until tomorrow, or that would have made your day easier if they had been completed? And every single one of them said that they do. I asked the same question, do you really ever go home and think about, if only I'd had that one conversation with somebody, or if only I'd patted them on the shoulder and told them what a good job they were doing, if only I'd recognised them for their achievements and their efforts and being part of the team, if only I'd given them just that momentary bit of validation that some people very clearly need. The people who are actually on the other side of that grid, on the more people and extrovert side. And so it was an interesting conversation that ended up with us really concluding that what we've got, even in a dealership that's really quite progressive and does a lot around management development, is we've got a lot of people who are naturally leaning towards the task and getting the results, of course, but more doing that from a task perspective than from a people perspective. So, is it any wonder that when they're under pressure and the targets go up and the objectives go up, or we're at a time where we're perhaps not meeting our targets, that the pressure is felt and they can feel a little discombobulated? So there you have it. I myself have concluded today that, the light bulb for me has gone on. We have a lot of managers across our industry who are actually far more task-oriented and a lot more introvert than perhaps you would imagine a manager's job to be. Because as I've always maintained, if your job has the word manager in it and you've got people involved, your job is the people. That is your task. And I will stand by that all day long. So anyway, there you go. That was a little bit of discombobulated part 2, unintentionally, but a real simple, if you like, way of thinking about what we talked about last time. So Hope that makes some sense. As always, if you want to get in touch, you know how to get hold of me, stephen.whitton@menable.org. And I will happily run through that little grid with you and send you a little PDF of it if you want, for you to be able to have a closer look at. Now, I know that this time Karl is going to be presenting with with Curtis. So, Karl, I know you've been a bit discombobulated, haven't you? Because you've not been feeling right this week. So just wanted to send you love and hugs, mate. And hope everything is going well. And have a good weekend, everyone. And we will catch up with you soon. Take care.
Well, Karl, you got a shout out there from Stephen Whitton, so congratulations on that. And I must say, I was one of the people who rushed to Steve to congratulate him on reintroducing the word discombobulate, which has kind of fallen out of the lexicon, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. But let's be honest, Steve is in a group of one, isn't he? You know, there's only one Steve Whitton, and he brightens my day when I'm interacting with him. So he's a good guy.
He is the compare with no compare.
I don't suppose he asked you to say that, did he?
He pays me good money to say that.
Yes.
But seriously though, I mean, what Steve was talking about there, this this disconnection between being people focused and work focused. I mean, that's presumably something you must have seen a lot in your days at Coachwork.
Yeah, but we're if we talk about the motor industry, that's a high turnover, low return on sales. You know, I've been around it for 42, 3 years, wherever it is. And for most of those 4 decades or more, it's been a 1% return on sales industry for the average all brand retailer. That's grown to more like 2.25 during COVID, and it's coming back down to start with a 1 again. So it's a tight margin industry. It's a data driven industry. And I remember one captain of industry actually saying to the camera, I run a data in our sector, I run a data business. And I was shouting at the telly, no, you run a people business.
Yeah.
And we need data to help make decisions, but we shouldn't just be making data-driven decisions. So I think Stephen's got something there. I think walking from A to B, that's an opportunity to recognise and congratulate and to coach your people. It's a people business.
Yeah, most definitely. And as Stephen said, if you do want to contact him, you can find him online at menable.org, or you can email him at stephen.whitton@menable.org. And that's Stephen with a PH. He's also on LinkedIn and easy to find there. So last two stories, Karl. The first one is from the Mail Online. And the rather long headline is Fiat boss says it is reintroducing a petrol-engined 500 city car because older drivers don't want EVs. So that pretty much tells the story. But the reason I chose it was it's actually unusual, isn't it, to have a reintroduction of a petrol engine car into an EV, because what Fiat can't do, because the last generation 500 ICE vehicle was over 20 years old, and that architecture no longer complies with the latest rules and regs. So what they have to do now is retrofit a petrol powertrain into the latest 500e. So quite an interesting one, this.
It is. How on earth they're ever going to make a profit out of those units when
Yes.
they've sort of built them twice? I don't know, but I think they are facing up to the reality that Europe is building twice as many cars as consumers want to buy. And I also read an article in the last few weeks that used the term early adopters globally are now fully absorbed for full EVs. And the early majority is not engaging quickly enough. So it's the first. It may not be the last, but at the end of the day, if we're going to sell more EVs, we need more incentive. And the Nordic countries, they're always hailed as the leaders at adopted EVs because there was a load of support behind them. So whilst prices are coming down, Curtis, I think without government intervention, And let's not even get into range anxiety until we see that 750 miles range of a Toyota that's due in due course. Unless we get more government support, I don't think we're going to get the uptake that we really need to meet the targets that we need to meet.
Yeah.
State the obvious.
Yeah, no, definitely, totally agree with you, and it's worth pointing out that in the example of the 500. So last year, almost 2/3 of all 500s registrations across Europe were petrol, despite the 500e offering the latest tech and far more advanced package. That's what buyers were focusing in on, the petrol model, which is really what's caused this rethink at Fiat HQ. So be interesting to see if anyone else follows suit on this, because there will be a lot of pressure now to deliver some of those petrol variants that because customers aren't necessarily going for the latest EVs, and that there is a lot of interest still in petrol and diesel. So we'll see how that one pans out. So final story this week comes from Car Dealer, and the headline is Ford goes back to the future as it revives iconic Capri nameplate as electric SUV. So this really does follow hot on the heels of what Ford did a couple of years ago with the Mustang, because it revived the Mustang name, which had been dormant for since the 70s, I guess, as a brand new car, as a brand new all-electric car. So it's doing the same with the Capri. It's being introduced as an electric SUV. And it's probably worth just looking at a brief history of the Capri, because you'll know a lot of this, Phil. You'll know a lot of this, Carl. So I can't get used to Phil not being at the other end. So it was launched in the late 1960s. The original Capri became certainly a film favourite throughout the 80s, with its long bonnet and sort of muscle car focus. And at the beginning of the programme, we were talking about the Professionals, which is where it featured on a weekly basis every Saturday night. You'd see the Capris racing around in the Professionals. Now, a question for you, Carl. Did you ever own one?
I didn't, and just for the younger listeners, the Professionals was a cop show, and there was two maverick characters. One that had a very, very dodgy perm, but so did Kevin Keegan back in the day. No, I didn't own one, but my wife, actually, her first three boyfriends had Capris, which I don't know what that says. Maybe it just says it had a lot of curb appeal. But eventually she saw the light and came over to a more considered individual with a Citroen 2CV. But there's not a lot of similarity between the old one and the new one. And in some respects, that's good, because the old one, despite looking fantastic, handled like a dog.
Yeah.
I never owned one, but I drove several. There's noise. It's good noise. It's a great line, Back to the Future. But a bit like Mustang, it will cause a degree of consternation from the true followers of the original. But it's evolution. It's 2024. We've got to get over it. As long as there's some relevance to the nomenclature of the model, so what? Let's do it.
Yeah, and I guess it does actually pose the question that Ford is sitting on a lot of historic names. So will we see the return of the Cortina, the Anglia, the Granada, the Thunderbird? Probably not the Probe, I would suggest. Or even in recent years, the Fiesta and Mondeo. So there's a lot of names that it's got to choose from for future models.
This is definitely starting to sound like Smashing and 90 now. So
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Maybe it's time to wrap it up.
Well, on that note, as we've got to the end of this week's shows, plenty of meaty headlines this week, from Glyn Hopkin's move into employee ownership to James Brearley taking the reins at Lookers, Kia outperforming in customer satisfaction, to Fiat retrofitting a petrol powertrain into an EV. Good luck with that. and the Blue Oval, reviving an iconic name. But that's all for now. So many thanks to you, Karl, for co-hosting. I hope you've enjoyed the experience, have you?
I have, yeah, absolutely. Privilege.
Yeah, we'll keep you on speed dial should Phil and I decide to take an emergency holiday. So do keep that line open for us.
Yeah, and just on that point, have you seen how much luggage he actually packs for a holiday?
Yes,
He
yeah,
definitely wasn't going trekking, was he?
yeah. He's the only person I know who talks about packing in phases. And certainly last time we spoke, he was gearing up for phase 4 of what I suspect was probably more than 10.
Indeed.
But that's all for now. So many thanks for joining us on the Motor Trade Radio podcast. Many thanks again to Karl Davis for sitting in for Phil. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me. I don't know whether I'm smashy or nicey, but it's goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to the Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by Motors, the driving force behind multi-site advertising. We'll be sharing all the URLs from this week's headlines on Monday morning. To make sure you receive them, just subscribe to the free newsletter on our LinkedIn page. Just search Motor Trade Radio Podcast.